The morning they came to throw her out, Dr. Elias Bennett was already walking up the cobblestone path to the Victorian estate. He arrived just as Rebecca Harrington's last thread of hope was being severed by the cold hands of her husband's family. And what he witnessed that sunrise would change the course of 3 lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind swept fallen maple leaves across the Harrington estate, a sprawling property in coastal Maine that had belonged to the same family for 5 generations. Rebecca stood at the bay window in the library, her fingers wrapped around a porcelain teacup that had long gone cold, watching the empty gardens that once flourished under her husband's attentive care. 8 months had passed since cancer claimed William from her, and in that time, the gardens had begun to whisper of neglect, not from lack of love, but from lack of means. At 34, Rebecca had never imagined she would face the world alone. She had married William Harrington when she was 22, a passionate artist from the neighboring town who fell in love with his intellectual depth and the way he spoke about medicine as if it were a sacred calling that could heal more than just bodies. They had built a life together in this grand old house, planning for children that never came, pouring their hearts into William's medical research instead. The estate itself told the story of their years together. William had converted the East Wing into a research library during their 3rd year of marriage, each book carefully selected and placed with the kind of devotion that comes from believing your work might someday save lives. The kitchen still held the scent of the lavender shortbread Rebecca baked every Sunday, filling the house with warmth that made colleagues linger after research discussions. In the study, William's favorite armchair remained empty by the fireplace, a cashmere throw still draped across its arm, as if he might return from his clinic at any moment. But William would not be returning, and his brother, Victor Harrington, had made it clear that Rebecca's time in the family home was at an end. Victor was a man who measured everything in profit margins and investment potential, including family loyalty. At 48, he had built a successful pharmaceutical company in Boston, accumulating wealth through strategic acquisitions and a willingness to terminate promising research when it failed to show immediate commercial potential. He was William's only living relative, and according to the will that William had hastily written during his final days, Victor now controlled the Harrington estate and William's research foundation. Rebecca had tried to reason with him during his first visit 2 weeks after the funeral. She had sat across from him in the very study where she and William had discussed medical breakthroughs and ethical research practices, explaining how she could continue William's work if given time. She knew every detail of his research, understood which projects showed the most promise, and where the greatest breakthroughs might occur. With continued funding during development phases, she could ensure William's life's work reached those who needed it most. Victor had listened with the patience of someone who had already finalized his decision. When she finished speaking, he had pulled out a leather portfolio of documents and spread them across the mahogany desk like chess pieces in a game. She didn't know she was playing. Market analyses, profit projections, acquisition offers. A European pharmaceutical giant wanted to buy William's research foundation and patents, dismantling his carefully constructed ethical frameworks in favor of maximizing shareholder value. "Rebecca," he had said, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of an executive delivering quarterly disappointments, "I understand this is difficult, but sentiment doesn't fund medical research or maintain historic properties. This offer represents more money than William's Foundation could generate in 30 years of breakthrough discoveries." She had stared at the papers, seeing numbers that meant nothing compared to the value of continuing William's mission to develop affordable treatments for rare childhood diseases. "William devoted his life to helping children who can't afford treatment," she had whispered. "William is gone," Victor had replied, not unkindly, but with finality. "And preserving his idealism won't bring him back. Harrington Pharmaceuticals is prepared to offer you generous compensation for transferring all research and vacating the property, enough to establish yourself elsewhere, perhaps even fund your own modest foundation. That conversation had taken place 3 weeks ago. Since then, Rebecca had received 2 more visits from Victor, each one less patient than the last. The final visit had come yesterday, accompanied by a woman in an impeccable suit who introduced herself as a representative of Meridian Global Pharmaceuticals. They had given her 48 hours to collect her personal belongings and sign the transfer documents. Now as the sun climbed higher over the Maine coastline, Rebecca could see the procession of vehicles approaching from the main road. 3 cars making their way up the long drive that William had lined with flowering cherry trees during their 5th year of marriage. She recognized Victor's sleek silver Mercedes in the lead, followed by what appeared to be an official-looking black SUV and another luxury sedan she didn't recognize. Rebecca set down her teacup and walked to the grand entryway, stepping onto the marble floor that she and William had carefully restored piece by piece after discovering the original stonework beneath layers of carpet. She was wearing one of her best dresses, a deep emerald silk that William had always loved, saying it matched the color of her eyes. Her auburn hair was pinned back neatly, and despite the circumstances, she carried herself with the quiet dignity that had earned her respect among the medical research community. The vehicles came to a stop in the circular drive, and Rebecca watched as Victor emerged from his car, followed by the woman from Meridian Pharmaceuticals. From the black SUV stepped a tall man in a tailored navy suit, whom Rebecca recognized immediately as Dr. Elias Bennett, the county medical examiner and a former colleague of William's. The 3rd car disgorged 2 men in business attire, who began unloading briefcases and document folders. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Victor approached the front steps with the confidence of a man accustomed to acquiring whatever he desired. He was expensively dressed in the manner of Boston elite, his suit custom-tailored and his Italian leather shoes gleaming in the morning light. His face wore the expression of someone completing an unpleasant but necessary transaction. "Rebecca," he said, removing his sunglasses as he reached the bottom of the marble steps. "I had hoped we wouldn't need to do this the difficult way." Rebecca remained standing in the doorway, her hand resting on the ornate brass handle that William had polished to a gleam during rainy afternoons when patients canceled appointments. "This is my home, Victor. William wanted me to continue his work." "William left the estate and the foundation to the family," Victor corrected, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining a simple concept to a child. "I am the family now, and I've made the decision that's best for the Harrington legacy." The woman in the suit stepped forward, consulting a tablet. "Mrs. Harrington, I'm Alexandra Pierce from Meridian Global Pharmaceuticals. We've discussed the compensation package with Mr. Harrington here. You'll find it quite generous considering the circumstances." Rebecca looked at the document displayed on the tablet, then back at Victor. "What circumstances would those be?" "Miss Pierce?" Pierce glanced at Victor with uncertainty. "Well, the foundation's operating costs exceed its grant funding, and without sufficient income to maintain the research programs, the foundation's funding is secure for the next 3 years, Rebecca said firmly. "I secured the Peterson grant myself last month, along with the matching funds from the Children's Medical Initiative. The annual report shows we're on track to begin clinical trials for 2 treatments by next spring." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Victor's jaw tightened slightly, and Rebecca realized that he had deliberately withheld this information from his business partners. She had worked around the clock for weeks after William's death, writing grant proposals and meeting with potential donors, determined to keep the foundation's vital research moving forward. Dr. Bennett, who had remained silent until now, stepped closer to the house. He was younger than Victor, but older than Rebecca, perhaps in his early 40s, with kind eyes and the weathered hands of someone who worked with them daily rather than delegating to others. Unlike the others, he seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the situation unfolding before him. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, his voice carrying a note of respect, "I'm Dr. Bennett. I want you to understand that I'm here purely as a medical advisor regarding the research protocols. I'm not involved in the business aspects of this transition." Rebecca studied his face, noting the sincerity in his voice. She had heard of Elias Bennett, though they had only met briefly at medical conferences. "You're going to take it one step at a time," Dr. Bennett said gently, "and you're going to remember that you're not alone in this fight." As he walked back to his vehicle, Rebecca remained sitting on the marble steps, watching the sun climb higher over the gardens that William had loved. The morning that had started with such fear and uncertainty had taken an unexpected turn, and for the first time in months, she felt a small flame of hope flickering in her chest. The battle for William's legacy was far from over, but she was no longer fighting it alone. 3 days passed before Rebecca ventured into Harborview, the coastal town where she had built connections during 12 years of marriage. The small community of 5,000 souls nestled along the rocky coastline, its main street lined with historic buildings that had weathered countless nor'easters. Rebecca had always felt at home here, welcomed by local business owners who appreciated the Harrington Foundation's contributions to the community hospital and by families whose children had benefited from William's specialized medical care. But walking down Ocean Avenue that Thursday morning, Rebecca felt the weight of every gaze that followed her progress. News traveled quickly in a close-knit community, and the story of Dr. Bennett's intervention at the Harrington estate had spread through Harborview like wildfire through dry summer grass. The details had grown in the telling, as such stories always do, and Rebecca could feel the speculation swirling around her like sea spray on a windy day. She pushed open the door to Morrison's pharmacy, the brass bell announcing her arrival. With its familiar chime, Harold Morrison looked up from behind the counter where he was filling prescriptions, his lined face breaking into a smile that seemed forced around the edges. "Morning, Rebecca," he said, his voice carrying a careful neutrality that hadn't been there before. "What can I do for you today?" Rebecca pulled her shopping list from her purse, noting how Harold's eyes darted toward the other customers in the store. 2 women from the hospital auxiliary were examining vitamins near the window, their conversation dropping to whispers as Rebecca passed. A fisherman she recognized but couldn't name was browsing the cold remedies, his movements deliberately focused on his task. "I need some of William's special headache formula," Rebecca said, keeping her voice steady. "And if you have any of those sleep aids Dr. Winters recommended, I've been having trouble resting." Harold nodded and began gathering her items, but Rebecca could sense his discomfort. They had known each other for over a decade, had weathered health crises and medical breakthroughs together. Yet now he seemed to be handling her like a fragile specimen that might shatter at any moment. "Rebecca," he said quietly as he packaged her purchases, "I heard there was some trouble out at your place." The 2 women from the hospital auxiliary had moved closer, their pretense of examining vitamins becoming increasingly transparent. Rebecca recognized them as Margaret Caldwell and her friend Judith, wives of prominent local physicians who had always treated Rebecca with polite distance. They were part of the social circle that revolved around the medical establishment, the ones whose opinions carried weight in hospital boards and community health initiatives. "Nothing I can't handle," Rebecca replied, accepting her package. But as she turned to leave, Margaret Caldwell stepped directly into her path. "Mrs. Harrington," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to chairing committees, "I hope you understand the position you're putting people in with this situation." Rebecca felt her spine stiffen. "I'm not sure." "What you mean, Mrs. Caldwell?" Margaret exchanged a meaningful glance with Judith. "Well, surely you can see how it looks. A young widow living alone in that big house, causing disputes between family members over valuable medical research. People are beginning to talk. Let them talk, Rebecca said, moving toward the door. But Judith blocked her path, creating an effective barrier. It's not just talk, dear. Some folks are saying that perhaps it would be better for everyone if you turned the research over to professionals, somewhere more appropriate for specialized medical development. The phrase hung in the air like salt spray, stinging and pervasive. Rebecca understood the subtext perfectly. In their minds, she was no longer the respected research partner she had been for 12 years. She was a complication, a burden. Woman without proper medical credentials trying to manage what should be left to real professionals. My husband and I built that foundation together, Rebecca said, her voice gaining strength. I have overseen every research protocol, written every grant proposal, and coordinated every clinical trial for the past decade. I fail to see what's inappropriate about continuing that work. Harold Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. Ladies, perhaps this conversation would be better continued elsewhere, but Margaret was undeterred. Mrs. Harrington, I'm only thinking of the children who need these treatments. Having Dr. Bennett take your side against Victor Harrington, well, it's bound to cause speculation about the nature of your relationship with the county medical examiner. The accusation hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame, but from anger at the casual cruelty of the suggestion. These women who had attended foundation fundraisers and praised William's dedication were now willing to destroy her character based on nothing more than gossip and prejudice. Dr. Bennett was ensuring proper medical ethics were followed, Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the fury building inside her. He was protecting patients' rights and research integrity. Nothing more. Judith leaned closer, lowering her voice to a stage whisper that carried clearly through the pharmacy. But, dear, surely you can see how it appears. An attractive young widow and a single doctor with a reputation for gallantry. People will draw their own conclusions. Rebecca set her package down on the counter with deliberate care. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority that had made her respected among medical researchers, the same tone she had used to mediate disputes at ethics committee meetings and coordinate complex multi-site clinical trials. Mrs. Caldwell, she said, looking directly into Margaret's eyes, I have devoted the last 12 years to helping children with diseases so rare that most pharmaceutical companies consider them unprofitable to treat. I have held the hands of parents receiving devastating diagnoses and helped researchers develop treatments that have saved lives. My reputation was built on dedication and scientific integrity, not gossip and speculation. The pharmacy had grown completely silent. Even the fishermen had stopped browsing to listen. Rebecca could feel the weight of their attention, but instead of shrinking from it, she drew strength from the truth of her words. If you choose to believe rumors over the evidence of your own experience with me, that says more about your character than mine, she continued. And if you think Dr. Bennett was wrong to ensure that patient rights were protected before research was transferred, then I suggest you examine your own commitment to medical ethics. With that, she picked up her package and walked to the door, her head held high despite the burning sensation behind her eyes. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, she heard the explosion of whispered conversation that followed her exit. But she didn't look back. The walk to her car seemed endless. Every person she passed seemed to stare, and Rebecca wondered how many had already heard versions of the story that painted her as everything from a scheming opportunist to a naive idealist who didn't understand the realities of medical research. By the time she reached her vehicle, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely fit the key into the ignition. The drive home took her past the small memorial garden where William's ashes had been scattered beneath a simple granite bench that bore his name and the words, healer, husband, humanitarian. Rebecca pulled over and sat in the car for several minutes, staring at the peaceful garden and fighting the urge to scream at the unfairness of it all. When she finally arrived back at the estate, she found an unexpected visitor waiting on her doorstep. Catherine Winters, the elderly attorney who had helped William draft his will, sat on one of the stone benches that flanked the entrance. She was a thin, scholarly woman in her 70s, with silver hair and bright eyes behind fashionable glasses. "Catherine," Rebecca said, surprised. "I wasn't expecting you." She stood as Rebecca approached, adjusting her tailored blazer with old-fashioned elegance. "Rebecca, I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced. I heard about the trouble you've been having with Victor." Rebecca unlocked the front door and gestured for her to come inside. The house still smelled faintly of the tea and toast Rebecca had made that morning, the simple comfort foods that had sustained her through the difficult weeks since William's death. She offered Catherine tea, grateful for the distraction of familiar hospitality. "I should have come sooner," Catherine said as they settled in William's study. "But I wanted to review William's will carefully before offering any advice." Rebecca's heart quickened. "Have you found something?" Catherine pulled a folder from her briefcase and opened it to reveal several pages of legal documents. William's will is unfortunately vague in several key areas. He was quite ill when he dictated it to me, and I'm afraid we both assumed he would have time to create a more detailed version. Rebecca felt her hopes deflating like a sail in dying wind. "So Victor is right. He does own the foundation." "Not necessarily," Catherine said, adjusting her glasses. "The will states that the foundation and estate go to the Harrington family. Victor is interpreting that to mean it reverts to him as the senior blood relative, but there's another way to read it." She pointed to a specific passage in the document. "You became a Harrington when you married William. Legally you have as much claim to be considered the Harrington family as Victor does. The question is whether we can convince a judge to see it that way." Rebecca studied the cramped handwriting, remembering the day William had insisted on making the will despite his weakness. She had tried to convince him to wait until he felt stronger, but he had been adamant that their affairs be in order. Now she wished they had been more specific about his intentions. "What would I need to do?" she asked. Catherine leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "We would need to file a petition with the probate court, challenging Victor's interpretation of the will. It would require testimony about William's intentions, evidence of your contributions to the foundation, and character witnesses who could speak to your role in the research." The last part made Rebecca's stomach clench. After her experience in town that morning, she wasn't sure how many character witnesses she could count on. The thought of having her professional qualifications and personal life dissected in a public courtroom filled her with dread. "How long would something like that take?" she asked. "Months, possibly," Catherine admitted. "And there's no guarantee. We would win. Courts tend to favor blood relatives in inheritance disputes, especially when dealing with valuable intellectual property and real estate." Rebecca stared out the study window at the greenhouse where William had spent so many hours, tending to plants with potential medical applications. The same greenhouse where he had taught her to identify compounds with healing properties, and where they had spent countless evenings discussing breakthrough possibilities. "There's something else you should know," Catherine said gently. "Victor came to see me yesterday." Rebecca turned back to her, sensing trouble in her tone. "He offered to increase my retainer substantially if I simply advised you to accept the compensation and move on quietly." Catherine continued, her voice heavy with distaste. "Suggested that it would be better for everyone if this matter didn't become a public legal battle." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. "What did you tell him?" Catherine's eyes flashed with anger. "I told him that my loyalty was to William's memory and to ensuring that his widow received fair treatment under the law. I also told him that if he ever insulted my integrity again, he would find himself looking for a new law firm." The elderly attorney's fierce defense of her interests brought tears to Rebecca's eyes. After the hostile reception she had received in town, Catherine's unwavering support felt like a lighthouse beam cutting through dense fog. "Thank you," she whispered. Catherine reached across the desk and patted Rebecca's hand with motherly kindness. "William was a good man, and he loved you deeply. Whatever happens, I want you to know that his intentions were honorable, even if his will wasn't as clear as it should have been." As the afternoon wore on, Catherine helped Rebecca understand the legal complexities of her situation. The process would be expensive, emotionally draining, and uncertain in its outcome. But it would also be her only chance to preserve the research foundation that represented everything she and William had built together. After Catherine left, Rebecca walked through the house that had been her sanctuary for 12 years. Every room held memories that seemed to whisper of happier times. The library where she and William had read medical journals together late into the night. The conservatory where they had celebrated research breakthroughs with champagne. The Finzum kitchen where she had learned to cook his favorite meals, and where he had surprised her with breakfast in bed on her birthday each year. As darkness fell, Rebecca lit the lamps and settled into William's chair by the fireplace. She could still detect the faint scent of his sandalwood cologne on the worn leather, a ghost of presence that both comforted and ached. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the salt spray from the nearby ocean, reminding her that autumn storms were approaching. Tomorrow she would have to decide whether to fight for William's legacy or accept defeat gracefully. The choice would determine not just where she would live, but who she would become in the aftermath of loss. As she sat in the gathering darkness, Rebecca realized that she was not just fighting for property or legal rights. She was fighting for the right to honor her husband's compassion, to continue work that brought hope to desperate families, and to prove that a woman's contribution to medical research could be just as valid as any man's claim of ownership. The flames danced in the fireplace, casting shadows that seemed to dance with possibilities. In the morning, Rebecca would begin the fight for William's legacy and her future. But tonight, she would sit with her memories and draw strength from the love that had brought her to this place. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the same determination that had carried her through 12 years of partnership, countless research setbacks, and the long, painful months of William's final illness. The first hard frost came early that year, coating the Maine coastline in crystalline armor that sparkled like diamonds in the dawn light. Rebecca stood at her study window, watching the sun paint the frozen gardens in shades of gold and amber, when she heard the sound of an automobile engine navigating the curved driveway. It was barely 7:30 in the morning, too early for social calls or business visits. She recognized the modest blue sedan immediately. It belonged to Dr. Sarah Chun, a brilliant pediatric neurologist who had collaborated with William on several research protocols. Rebecca had met her years ago at a medical conference, where William had initiated a conversation about emergent treatments for lysosomal storage disorders. Sarah was a thoughtful woman in her late 40s with skilled hands and perceptive eyes that noticed details others overlooked. What surprised Rebecca was seeing her at the door at all. The social divisions in the medical community had become increasingly rigid since William's death, with colleagues taking sides in the brewing conflict over the foundation's future. She pulled on a cardigan and hurried downstairs, wondering what could have brought Sarah Chun to her home on such a cold morning. When she opened the door, she found Sarah standing with a thick folder tucked under her arm, her breath visible in small clouds. Behind her, Rebecca could see two other people waiting in the car, both wearing the practical clothing of medical professionals. "Rebecca," Sarah said, her voice respectful but determined, "I apologize for the early hour, but I was hoping we could speak with you about the foundation situation." Rebecca stepped aside, gesturing for them to come in from the cold. "Of course, Dr. Chun. Please bring your colleagues inside. I'll make some coffee." The three visitors entered cautiously, clearly uncomfortable with the informality of the invitation. Rebecca recognized the others as Dr. Michael Abernathy, an elderly physician whose research on rare genetic disorders had laid the groundwork for much of William's research, and Dr. Liam Santos, a young Filipino-American immunologist who had recently joined the Children's Hospital where many of the Foundation's patients received treatment. As Rebecca busied herself with the coffee, Sarah cleared her throat and began to speak. "Rebecca, we heard about what happened with Victor Harrington and those pharmaceutical people. Word gets around quickly in research circles, especially when it concerns pediatric treatment protocols." She turned to face them, noting the serious expressions on their faces. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm not sure how my troubles could affect your work." Dr. Abernathy stepped forward, his arthritic hands wrapped around his medical bag. "Mrs. Harrington, with respect, you might be surprised how much your situation affects all of us who treat rare childhood disorders." Dr. Santos nodded agreement. "Meridian Global Pharmaceuticals," he said, his voice carrying both precision and concern. "They approached Children's Hospital last month. Want to acquire rights to experimental treatments developed in our research division. When Hospital Board hesitated, they found ways to apply pressure. Research grants suddenly became difficult to secure. Equipment orders faced mysterious delays." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Are you saying that Victor's deal with Meridian isn't just about William's Foundation?" Sarah accepted a cup of coffee with grateful hands. "Rebecca, Meridian has been systematically acquiring intellectual property rights to rare disease treatments across the Northeast. They're planning to consolidate research under their corporate umbrella, complete with streamlined trials and accelerated approval processes. Your foundation's work on enzyme replacement therapies sits right at the center of their acquisition strategy." The implication struck Rebecca like a physical blow. She sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her mind racing through her conversations with Victor. He had presented the sale as a simple business decision, a way to maximize the value of the Harrington research. But if these doctors were right, Victor's urgency had nothing to do with family finances and everything to do with a much larger pharmaceutical consolidation scheme. "How do you know all this?" she asked. Dr. Abernathy leaned forward conspiratorially. "My daughter works for the FDA's Orphan Drug Approval Division. Sees all sorts of applications come through there. Meridian has filed preliminary plans for fast-tracking what they're calling Project Renaissance. Covers nearly all the active rare pediatric disease research in New England, including most of the promising treatments for conditions with limited patient populations." Dr. Santos pulled a folded paper from his lab coat pocket. "I saved this from internal hospital bulletin board. Meridian announces acquisition, strategy for consolidating fragmented research efforts, and bringing efficiency to rare disease market. Promising faster drug development, they say." Rebecca unfolded the document, scanning the corporate language with growing dismay. The pharmaceutical giant's plans were even more extensive than the doctors had described. They envisioned a complete transformation of rare disease research, replacing independent foundations and university partnerships with centralized corporate labs, designed to maximize patentable treatments and minimize unprofitable compassionate use programs. "This explains why they're so desperate to acquire William's research," Sarah explained. "Without the Harrington enzyme protocols, their consolidation strategy has a significant gap right in the middle of it. They can't build their treatment portfolio or position their market dominance the way they want." Rebecca stared at the bulletin, feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted fundamentally. She had thought she was fighting to preserve her home and William's memory. Now she realized she was standing in the path of forces much larger and more ruthless than one grieving widow's attachment to her husband's legacy. "But surely Victor doesn't understand the full scope of what he's agreeing to," she said. He knew how passionate William was about keeping treatments affordable and accessible to all patients. The three doctors exchanged glances that suggested they knew something Rebecca didn't. Finally, Dr. Abernathy spoke up reluctantly. "Rebecca, there's something else you should know. Victor Harrington isn't just selling to Meridian Pharmaceuticals. He's negotiated a position on their executive board. Senior Vice President of Acquisitions, according to the press release my daughter showed me." The betrayal cut deeper than Rebecca had expected. Victor wasn't just a grieving brother making difficult decisions about family property. He was an ambitious businessman who saw William's compassionate research as nothing more than a stepping stone to corporate advancement. The family legacy he claimed to be protecting was actually being sacrificed on the altar of his own career. Ambitions. How many other research programs are fighting this? Rebecca asked quietly. Sarah's expression grew grim. "More than you might think. Some have already sold out, either because they needed the funding or because Meridian made continued independent operation too difficult. Others are trying to hold on. But it's not easy when you're fighting alone." Dr. Santos nodded emphatically. "They use different tactics for different researchers. For some, they offer academic positions with impressive salaries. For others, they create problems. Regulatory reviews, funding complications, patient recruitment difficulties that appear from nowhere." Rebecca thought about the recent grant application that had been inexplicably delayed, forcing her to work around the clock to meet the revised submission deadline. She had assumed it was simply administrative inefficiency, but now she wondered if there had been more deliberate forces at work. "What can we do?" she asked. Dr. Abernathy leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Well, that depends on how far you're willing to go to fight this thing. If you're thinking about challenging Victor in court over the will, you should know that there are others who might be willing to help with that fight." "Help how?" Sarah set down her coffee cup and looked Rebecca directly in the eyes. "Rebecca, you seem like a principled person who's been treated unfairly, but more than that, your fight is our fight. If Meridian gets Williams' research, it makes their entire consolidation plan viable. If you can stop them, it might save a dozen other independent research programs in the process." The conversation continued over a second pot of coffee, with the doctors sharing more details about Meridian's tactics and the broader implications for patient care. The pharmaceutical giant wasn't just acquiring intellectual property. They were systematically dismantling the collaborative research model that had produced the most promising advances in rare disease treatment. The Foundation's work on Batten disease, Dr. Santos explained, represents hope for families who have been told their children face certain death. If Meridian shelves that research because the patient population is too small to generate sufficient profit. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Rebecca had met those families, had held mothers as they wept with the first fragile hope that their children might have a future. The thought that corporate calculations could extinguish that hope made her physically ill. As the morning progressed, the doctor's phones began to ring with calls from colleagues who had heard about their meeting. By noon, Rebecca's kitchen had become an impromptu strategy session, with physicians joining remotely via speakerphone and others arriving in person as their schedules allowed. Dr. Elias Bennett arrived shortly after lunch. Having been contacted by Sarah Chun, his presence added a new dimension to the gathering, as his role as county medical examiner gave him insights into regulatory processes that the clinical physicians lacked. The legal battle over the will is just one front in this fight, Dr. Bennett explained as he studied the documents spread across Rebecca's kitchen table. "We also need to think about patient protections, ethics board reviews, and research protocol transfers." The kitchen that had once hosted intimate dinners for Williams' research colleagues was now buzzing with the energy of resistance. Doctors who had competed for grants were now sharing resources and strategizing about how to protect their collective work from corporate appropriation. By mid-afternoon, the impromptu gathering had evolved into something more organized. Dr. Abernathy suggested forming a formal coalition of independent researchers dedicated to preserving patient-centered Approaches to rare disease treatment. We need a name, Sarah said, something that represents what we're fighting for. After several suggestions were discussed and discarded, Rebecca spoke up. The Lighthouse Alliance, she said quietly. William always said that researchers were like lighthouses, sending out beams of hope into the darkness of devastating diagnoses. The name resonated with the group, and within hours, the Lighthouse Alliance had taken shape. Dr. Abernathy would serve as medical director, Sarah Chun as research coordinator, and Dr. Santos would manage patient advocacy. They asked Rebecca to serve as executive director, recognizing that her combination of research knowledge and personal stake in the fight made her uniquely qualified to lead the resistance against Meridian's takeover. As the doctors began to leave, making plans to reconvene the following evening with additional colleagues, Dr. Bennett remained behind. He stood by the windows overlooking the garden, his expression thoughtful as he watched the last light of day illuminate the frost-covered plants in William's medicinal garden. Mrs. Harrington, he said, I want you to understand that forming this alliance puts a target on your back. Meridian and Victor will see this as a direct challenge, and they're likely to escalate their tactics. Rebecca joined him at the window, watching as the setting sun cast long shadows across the garden where William had cultivated hope along with healing plants. I know, she said simply, but what choice do I have? If I surrender William's research, I'm not just betraying his memory, I'm abandoning the children who depend on these treatments. Dr. Bennett nodded, his profile outlined in the golden light of sunset. I just want you to be prepared. Corporate interests like Meridian don't fight fair, and they have resources that independent researchers can only dream of. We have something they don't, Rebecca replied. We have the truth about what happens to patients when treatment decisions are made based on profit margins instead of medical need. As Dr. Bennett prepared to leave, Rebecca found herself asking the question that had been on her mind since the morning he had intervened on her behalf. Dr. Bennett, why are you risking your professional standing to help me? You barely knew William. He paused at the door, his expression difficult to read in the fading light. I knew him well enough, he said quietly. Well enough to recognize a healer whose first concern was always the patient, never the profit. Those are becoming rare in modern medicine, Mrs. Harrington. When someone tries to extinguish that kind of light, those of us who still believe in the healing profession have an obligation to protect it. Rebecca nodded, understanding the warning. She had spent the night preparing not just heartfelt pleas about William's intentions, but substantive arguments about her own contributions to the Foundation's intellectual property and the legal implications of transferring research protocols without proper ethics board review. Inside the courthouse, the wood-paneled hallways echoed with footsteps as the crowd made its way to courtroom 3. Rebecca could feel tension building in her chest with each step. So much depended on the next few hours, not just her home and William's legacy, but the future of treatments that children desperately needed. Victor Harrington was already seated at the plaintiff's table when Rebecca entered the courtroom, flanked by 2 attorneys in expensive suits. Behind them sat Alexandra Pierce from Meridian Pharmaceuticals, her tablet computer open and her expression calculated. Victor looked up as Rebecca walked in, his eyes widening slightly at the crowd that followed her. For a brief moment, Rebecca caught a flicker of uncertainty in her brother-in-law's expression. Perhaps he had expected this to be a straightforward legal proceeding, a simple matter of asserting familial rights over an estate. The presence of so many people whose lives had been touched by the Foundation seemed to unsettle him, though he quickly masked his reaction behind a facade of professional detachment. Judge Hamilton entered from his chambers precisely at 9 a.m., his weathered face impassive as he surveyed the unusually crowded courtroom. He was a man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes that suggested nothing escaped his notice. I see we have quite an audience today, he observed dryly. Let me be clear from the outset. This is not a public forum or a town hall meeting. This is a legal proceeding to determine ownership rights to the Harrington Research Foundation and associated properties. I expect decorum from everyone present. The judge reviewed the filings before him, occasionally glancing up at Victor or Rebecca. Mr. Harrington, you've requested this emergency hearing claiming that delays in transferring the Foundation's assets are causing potential harm to research subjects. Please present your case. Victor's attorney rose, a polished man in his 50s with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to winning. Your Honor, this is fundamentally a simple matter of inheritance law. Dr. William Harrington's will clearly states that, upon his death, the Foundation and estate revert to the Harrington family. As Dr. Harrington's only living blood relative, Victor Harrington is the legal inheritor of these assets. The attorney presented a series of documents outlining Victor's claim, emphasizing William's failure to specify an alternative succession plan for the Foundation. He argued that Rebecca, while respected as William's widow, lacked the medical credentials and financial resources to properly manage a research organization of the Foundation's complexity. Furthermore, Your Honor, he continued, Mr. Harrington has arranged a beneficial partnership with Meridian Global Pharmaceuticals that will ensure the Foundation's valuable research reaches patients more quickly and efficiently. Each day this transfer is delayed potentially denies treatment to children with life-threatening conditions. The invocation of suffering children caused a murmur to ripple through the courtroom. Rebecca felt anger rising in her chest at the manipulation, but Catherine placed a restraining hand on her arm, a silent reminder to maintain composure. When Victor's attorney finished, Judge Hamilton turned to Catherine. Counsel for Mrs. Harrington, your response? Catherine rose slowly, her movements deliberate but energetic. Unlike Victor's attorney with his slick presentation, Catherine carried the gravitas of someone whose legal expertise had been earned through decades of actual case law rather than corporate maneuvering. Your Honor, while Mr. Harrington's counsel presents this as a simple inheritance matter, the reality is considerably more complex. Mrs. Harrington is not merely the widow of Dr. William Harrington. She was his research partner for 12 years, contributing substantially to the intellectual property that forms the Foundation's core assets. Catherine presented documentation showing Rebecca's name on research papers, grant applications, and patent filings. She emphasized that the Foundation's successful grant renewals had been secured by Rebecca after William's death, demonstrating her capability to manage its operations. Most significantly, Your Honor, the will's reference to the Harrington family is ambiguous in a legal context. Rebecca Harrington became part of the Harrington family through marriage. In the absence of specific direction, excluding the spouse from the definition of family, standard legal practice would include Mrs. Harrington in that designation. As Catherine presented her arguments, Rebecca watched Judge Hamilton's face for any indication of his leanings. His expression remained studiously neutral, though she noted that he paid particular attention to the research documentation showing her contributions to the Foundation's work. After Catherine concluded her initial presentation, the judge allowed Victor's attorney to respond. The legal battle continued for nearly an hour, with complex arguments about inheritance law, intellectual property rights, and the definition of family in testamentary documents. Throughout this exchange, Rebecca noticed Judge Hamilton repeatedly glancing at the filled gallery. The presence of so many people affected by the Foundation's work seemed to give him pause, though he maintained strict control over the proceedings, preventing any outbursts or testimonials from the audience. Finally, after both sides had presented their primary arguments, Judge Hamilton leaned forward. Before I consider a ruling, I'd like to hear directly from the principals. Mr. Harrington, please approach. Victor moved to the witness stand with the confidence of a man accustomed to boardroom authority. After being sworn in, he presented himself as a reluctant participant, forced to intervene in a failing enterprise. Your Honor, I respected my brother's work tremendously, Victor said, his voice modulated to convey sincerity. William was brilliant, but impractical when it came to business matters. The foundation he created is running significant deficits that threaten its long-term viability. My arrangement with Meridian ensures his research will reach patients who need it, rather than languishing in a foundation that cannot financially sustain itself. Judge Hamilton studied him carefully. Mr. Harrington, did your brother ever discuss his wishes for the foundation's future with you specifically? Victor hesitated, just briefly enough that Rebecca noticed. William was very ill toward the end. Your Honor, our conversations focused on his comfort and family matters, not business details. And yet you feel confident that he would approve of selling his research to a pharmaceutical corporation? I believe he would want his work to help as many children as possible, Victor replied smoothly. Meridian has the resources to bring these treatments to market globally, something the foundation simply cannot accomplish alone. After Victor's testimony, Judge Hamilton called Rebecca to the stand. As she rose from her seat, she felt a momentary wave of terror. Everything depended on her ability to articulate William's vision and her role in making it reality. Once sworn in, Rebecca faced the judge directly, drawing strength from the truth she was about to share. Your Honor, I'd like to clarify something about the Foundation's financial status that Mr. Harrington may not be aware of. Last month, I secured the Peterson Grant and matching funds from the Children's Medical Initiative, ensuring the Foundation's operations are fully funded for the next 3 years. She presented documentation showing the grant approvals and financial projections that demonstrated the Foundation's sustainability. The Foundation isn't failing financially. In fact, our approach of focusing on treatments for ultra-rare childhood disorders has attracted significant support from medical foundations, specifically because we prioritize patient access over profit margins. Judge Hamilton examined the financial documents with interest. Mrs. Harrington, what is your professional background? Do you have medical training? I have a master's degree in biochemistry. Your Honor, I managed research operations for the Foundation throughout my marriage to William, coordinating clinical trials, writing grant proposals, and liaising with patient families. While I am not a physician, I worked alongside William daily for 12 years and understand every aspect of the Foundation's research protocols. The judge nodded thoughtfully. And what do you believe would happen to these research protocols if Mr. Harrington's arrangement with Meridian Pharmaceuticals proceeds? Rebecca took a deep breath, knowing her answer needed to balance emotional truth with factual evidence. Based on Meridian's published business strategy and their statements to our ethics board, they plan to prioritize treatments with the largest potential market while shelving research for conditions affecting fewer patients. Our most promising protocol for Batten disease, which affects fewer than 500 children in the United States, would likely be deprioritized because the patient population is too small to generate sufficient return on investment. From the gallery came a soft sound halfway between a gasp and a sob. Rebecca didn't need to look to know it came from Elena Martinez, whose 7-year-old daughter Sophia had shown remarkable improvement on the Batten disease protocol. The thought of that treatment being abandoned for business reasons made the stakes of this hearing viscerally real. Judge Hamilton appeared to notice the reaction as well. His expression remained professional, but something in his eyes suggested he understood that clinical protocols were more than legal abstractions to the families present. Mrs. Harrington, do you believe you can effectively continue your husband's work without the resources of a corporation like Meridian? Rebecca met his gaze steadily. Your Honor, I believe that independence is precisely what makes our work valuable. We develop treatments because children need them, not because markets demand them. That approach has led to breakthroughs for conditions that pharmaceutical companies routinely ignore. After Rebecca's testimony, Judge Hamilton called a brief recess. As the courtroom emptied, Rebecca found herself surrounded by supportive families, each offering encouragement and sharing stories about how the foundation had impacted their lives. Elena Martinez approached with her daughter Sophia, a delicate child with luminous brown eyes that still held the spark of curiosity, despite the progressive nature of her condition. "Miss Rebecca," Sophia said, using the name she had called Rebecca since their first meeting 3 years earlier, "are you going to keep making my medicine?" The simple question cut through legal complexities to the heart of what was at stake. Rebecca knelt to meet the child's eyes. "I'm doing everything I can to make sure you and all the other children get the medicine you need." Elena squeezed Rebecca's hand. Before William's treatment protocol, the doctors told us Sophia wouldn't live to see her 8th birthday. She turns 8 next month, and she's still walking, still learning. Whatever happens today, we won't forget what you and William gave us, time we never thought we'd have. As the recess ended and everyone filed back into the courtroom, Rebecca carried these stories with her, a reminder that this fight wasn't about property rights or intellectual assets, but about children's lives and the parents who refused to surrender hope. Judge Hamilton returned to the bench with a thoughtful expression. "I've reviewed the documentation presented by both parties. This case presents unusually complex questions about the interpretation of Dr. William Harrington's will and the nature of the foundation he created." The courtroom fell completely silent as everyone waited for his decision. Rebecca could feel her heart pounding in her chest, aware that William's legacy hung in the balance. "In matters of testamentary interpretation," the judge continued, "the court must attempt to determine the testator's intent when language is ambiguous." The phrase "the Harrington family" could reasonably include both Mr. Victor Harrington as a blood relative and Mrs. Rebecca Harrington as the spouse of the deceased. Victor leaned forward slightly, his expression tense. Rebecca remained still, hardly daring to breathe. "However," Judge Hamilton said, "this case involves more than simple property inheritance. The Harrington Research Foundation is not merely an asset but an ongoing enterprise with obligations to research subjects, grant providers, and the medical community. The court must consider not only ownership rights, but also fiduciary responsibility and ethical obligations to vulnerable populations." He shuffled through the documents before him, selecting a specific page. "Mrs. Harrington has demonstrated substantial involvement in the foundation's operations and intellectual property development. Mr. Harrington has presented a commercial alternative that, while financially advantageous, raises questions about continuity of care for current research subjects." The judge set down his papers and looked directly at both parties. "Given these competing considerations, I am not prepared to issue a final ruling on ownership at this time. Instead, I am implementing a temporary injunction that prevents any transfer of the Foundation's assets or research protocols for a period of 90 days. Victor's attorney immediately rose to object, but Judge Hamilton raised his hand. "During this period, Mrs. Harrington will continue to manage the Foundation's operations and research activities. Mr. Harrington will have full access to financial records and research outcomes, but cannot execute any transfers or sales of intellectual property." He turned to address Victor directly. "Mr. Harrington, if you wish to pursue your claim further, the court will require more substantial evidence regarding your brother's specific intentions for the Foundation's future. Mere legal inheritance of property rights may not extend to the specialized research protocols developed through collaborative effort." Then he turned to Rebecca. "Mrs. Harrington, the court expects you to demonstrate that the Foundation can continue to function effectively under your leadership. 90 days, we will reconvene to evaluate the Foundation's operations and make a final determination regarding control." With that, Judge Hamilton adjourned the hearing, leaving both parties with a temporary resolution that satisfied neither completely but gave Rebecca what she needed most: time. As the courtroom emptied, Victor approached Rebecca, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes burning with frustration. "This changes nothing," he said quietly. "In 90 days I'll have documentation that proves William intended the foundation to remain under family control, his blood family." Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "Is that really what this is about, Victor? Family legacy? Or is it about your new executive position with Meridian?" A flicker of surprise crossed his face before he could mask it. "You don't understand the realities of medical research in today's market. Independent foundations like Williams are dinosaurs, inefficient, underfunded, and ultimately doomed to extinction." "Maybe," Rebecca replied, "but dinosaurs ruled the earth for millions of years before corporations decided they were inefficient. Sometimes the oldest approaches endure because they work, not because they're profitable." Victor's expression hardened. "Enjoy your 90 days of playing scientist, Rebecca. When this comes back to court, I'll make sure the judge understands exactly how unqualified you are to manage my brother's legacy." As he walked away, Rebecca felt a momentary wave of doubt. Victor had resources and connections she couldn't match. What if 90 days wasn't enough to prove the foundation's viability under her leadership? What if the temporary victory today only delayed the inevitable loss? A hand touched her shoulder gently, and she turned to find Dr. Bennett standing beside her. "That was well done," he said quietly. "Not a complete victory, but a fighting chance." Rebecca nodded, still processing the mixed outcome. 90 days isn't much time to prove we can operate effectively, especially with Victor watching for any mistake. "Then we'd better get to work," Dr. Bennett replied, "starting with a proper review of all active research protocols and patient enrollments. If we're going to prove the foundation's value, we need clear metrics and documented outcomes." As they left the courthouse, Rebecca found Sarah Chun waiting at the bottom of the steps. "I've been organizing the parents," Sarah explained. "They want to help. Testimonials, fundraising, volunteer hours, whatever it takes to keep the foundation going." Dr. Abernathy appeared, followed by Dr. Santos. "The medical community is watching this case with great interest," Dr. Abernathy said. "You've become a symbol of resistance to corporate medicine, whether you intended to or not." Rebecca looked at the small group of allies gathering around her and felt something shift inside her heart. She had entered the courthouse that morning, fighting to preserve William's legacy. She was leaving it as the leader of something larger, a movement to protect patient-centered medicine from corporate consolidation. "Thank you all," she said, emotion making her voice unsteady. "I couldn't do this alone." "You don't have to," Dr. Bennett assured her. "The Lighthouse Alliance is just getting started." As they walked back toward their cars, Catherine Winters caught up with them, her leather briefcase swinging energetically despite the morning's legal battle. "A word of warning," she said, falling into step beside Rebecca. "Victor won't waste these 90 days. He'll be gathering evidence, pressuring colleagues, possibly even trying to create problems for the foundation to demonstrate your inability to lead it." "What should we do?" Rebecca asked. Catherine's eyes gleamed with determination. "Document everything. Every success, every patient improvement, every grant dollar secured. Build a case that's so compelling even the most literal interpretation of the law can't ignore it." The small group paused in the courthouse parking lot, each person seemingly reluctant to disperse after the emotional intensity of the hearing. Rebecca looked at their faces, the elderly attorney who had stood by her principles despite pressure from Victor, the dedicated physicians who understood what was at stake for their patients, the parents whose children's lives hung in the balance of corporate decisions. 90 days, she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. 90 days to prove that medicine should be measured in lives improved, not just profits generated. 90 days to show that William's approach to healing deserves to continue. Dr. Bennett nodded, his expression thoughtful. It won't be easy. Meridian has already started approaching our research partners, suggesting that future collaboration depends on supporting Victor's position. Then we'll find new partners, Rebecca replied, a plan already forming in her mind. Universities, independent laboratories, international research cooperatives. There are still places where medical ethics haven't been completely replaced by market analysis. As the group dispersed, each heading back to their respective responsibilities, Rebecca remained standing in the parking lot for a moment, looking back at the courthouse where she had just won a temporary reprieve. The granite building stood solid against the bright autumn sky, a reminder that justice sometimes required patience and persistence rather than immediate resolution. She thought of William, of his unwavering belief that medicine should serve the patient first and the market second. He had built the foundation on that principle, had devoted his life to children whose rare conditions made them unprofitable to treat in a healthcare system increasingly driven by return on investment calculations. The battle to preserve his work was far from over, but for the first time since his death, Rebecca felt certainty replacing grief. She wasn't just fighting to hold on to memories of the past. She was fighting for a future where compassion remained at the heart of healing. And despite Victor's resources and Meridian's corporate power, that was a cause worth any struggle, any sacrifice, any risk. With renewed determination, Rebecca drove back to the estate that had once been just her home with William but was now the headquarters of a resistance movement. 90 days to save William's legacy. 90 days to prove that some things in medicine were still more valuable than profit margins and shareholder returns. 90 days to show the world that one determined woman could stand against a pharmaceutical giant and preserve the healing heart of medicine that had almost been lost. The challenge was daunting, but as William had often quoted to his research team when they faced seemingly impossible obstacles, it's not because things are difficult that we don't dare. It's because we don't dare that things are difficult. Rebecca was ready to dare greatly, not just for William's memory, but for every child whose life might depend on treatments deemed too unprofitable to pursue by corporate medicine. The fight was just beginning, but she was no longer fighting alone. 3 weeks after the courthouse hearing, Rebecca stood in the research greenhouse at the far edge of the Harrington estate, carefully examining a row of rare medicinal plants that William had cultivated for years. Each specimen was meticulously labeled with both scientific nomenclature and potential therapeutic applications. The December morning light filtered through the glass ceiling, turning the interior into a cathedral of healing possibilities. Dr. Sarah Chun moved among the plants with the focused attention of someone who understood their value beyond market assessments. She paused before a delicate flowering specimen with pale lavender blooms. Rauwolfia serpentina, she noted. William mentioned he was exploring its alkaloids for possible applications in neurological conditions. Rebecca nodded carefully, pruning a yellowing leaf from the plant. He believed that traditional medicinal plants often contained compounds that modern pharmaceutical approaches overlooked. This particular species showed promising results in early testing for tremor reduction in pediatric neurodegenerative conditions. The greenhouse had become an unexpected center of the Foundation's resistance strategy. While Victor focused his attention on the Maine research laboratory and clinical trial documentation, the botanical research had continued quietly in this glass sanctuary at the edge of the property, far from corporate scrutiny. The latest extraction yielded stronger results than we anticipated, Rebecca continued, gesturing toward her laboratory notebook. Dr. Abernathy thinks we might be ready for preliminary cellular testing by the end of the month. Sarah studied the notebook with professional interest. This could represent a significant breakthrough for children with tremor-dominant conditions. Has Victor shown any interest in the botanical research program? None, Rebecca replied with a small smile. He dismissed it as William's gardening hobby when he toured the property last week. I didn't correct his misunderstanding. The strategic deception felt justified given the circumstances. Victor had been methodically inventorying the foundation's assets, clearly preparing for the court's final determination at the end of the 90-day period. But his corporate mindset led him to focus exclusively on the more traditional pharmaceutical research, while overlooking the innovative botanical investigations that had been William's passion in his final years. "Rebecca," Sarah said, setting down the notebook, "there's something you should know. Meridian representatives have been approaching physicians at Children's Hospital, offering early access to their developmental pipeline in exchange for testimonials about the benefits of corporate research infrastructure." Rebecca's hands stilled. On the plant she was tending, "Are people accepting?" "Some are," Sarah admitted. "The offers are tempting: priority access to treatments, funding for additional staff positions, new equipment. For departments that have been chronically underfunded, it's hard to refuse." The news wasn't surprising, but it still stung. Rebecca had known from the beginning that Meridian's resources would allow them to apply pressure in ways she couldn't match. The pharmaceutical giant could offer immediate material benefits, while she could only promise ethical principles and patient-centered care, values that didn't show up on quarterly financial statements. "What about you?" Rebecca asked quietly. "Have they approached you?" Sarah's expression hardened. "3 times now. The latest offer included a research directorship with a salary twice what I currently make, plus guaranteed funding for 5 years. That's substantial." "It is," Sarah agreed. "But I've seen what happens when treatment decisions are made by finance departments instead of physicians. My parents couldn't afford the premium tier health insurance when I was growing up. I watched my brother receive diminished care because our family couldn't generate sufficient profit for the healthcare system. I won't participate in creating more tiered access to life-saving treatments." Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude for Sarah's principled stance, knowing how much easier it would have been for her to accept Meridian's offer. Such loyalty couldn't be purchased with corporate budgets or executive titles. "We should get back to the Maine lab," Rebecca said, checking her watch. "Dr. Bennett is bringing the latest testing results from the county hospital trial participants." As they walked through the winter gardens toward the main house, Rebecca marveled at how much had changed in the 3 weeks since the court hearing. The Harrington estate, once her private grief sanctuary, had transformed into the bustling headquarters of the Lighthouse Alliance. Physicians came and went at all hours, bringing research updates and patient data. The kitchen that had stood empty for months after William's death now regularly hosted strategy sessions and collaborative research discussions. Most significantly, Rebecca herself had changed. The paralyzing grief that had defined her existence since William's death had been channeled into purposeful action. She still missed him with an ache that never fully subsided, but now that pain coexisted with a fierce determination to protect what they had built together. Inside the main research laboratory, they found Dr. Bennett already setting up his presentation. On the large monitor, his normally calm demeanor seemed charged with unusual energy, and Rebecca immediately sensed that he brought significant news. "I'm glad you're both here," he said as they entered. "I've been reviewing the 6-month data from the enzyme replacement therapy trial. The results are, well, see for yourself." He pulled up a series of charts showing patient outcomes over time. Even to Rebecca's experienced eye, the progression was remarkable. Steady improvements in key biomarkers across the treatment group, with particularly striking results in the youngest participants. "This is even better than we projected," Sarah observed, studying the data with professional scrutiny. "Especially for the early intervention cohort," Dr. Bennett nodded. "The neurological preservation in participants under age 5 is unprecedented for this condition. Based on these outcomes, I believe we have sufficient evidence to apply for expanded access authorization from the FDA." The implications of his statement hung in the air between them. Expanded access would allow more children to receive the experimental treatment outside the formal clinical trial structure. Children, who might otherwise have no treatment options for their progressive conditions. Victor will fight this, Rebecca said, thinking through the implications. Expanded access would strengthen our position that the Foundation's work needs to continue independently. Let him fight, Dr. Bennett replied, a rare edge of steel in his voice. These results speak for themselves. Even the most profit-focused pharmaceutical executive would have difficulty arguing against making this treatment available to children who are running out of time. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Abernathy and Dr. Santos, both carrying thick folders of patient documentation. The elderly genetic specialist and the young immunologist had become unlikely allies in the Foundation's struggle, their generational differences bridged by shared commitment to patient-centered medicine. We've been analyzing the comparative data, Dr. Abernathy announced without preamble, his age-spotted hands spreading documents across the laboratory table, tracking outcomes between our treatment protocols and comparable corporate approaches. Dr. Santos nodded eagerly, results very compelling. For ultra-rare conditions, our patient-focused approach showing significantly better quality of life outcomes than one-size-fits-all corporate protocols. The morning evolved into an intense research session with the physicians analyzing data, comparing notes, and strategizing about how to document the Foundation's impact most effectively for the court's 90-day review. Rebecca moved among them, coordinating information, asking pointed questions, and ensuring that every significant finding was properly documented. Around noon, Catherine Winters arrived with lunch for the research team, her pragmatic support. A reminder that this battle required nourishment for both mind and body. As they ate sandwiches around the laboratory table, the elderly attorney updated them on the legal developments. Victor's legal team has filed a motion arguing that temporary management of the Foundation doesn't constitute beneficial ownership, Catherine explained. They're attempting to establish that regardless of operational success during these 90 days, the Foundation's assets still legally belong to Victor as William's blood relative. Rebecca set down her sandwich, appetite suddenly diminished. What does that mean for our strategy? Catherine's expression remained carefully neutral. It means we need more than just successful research outcomes. We need to demonstrate that William specifically intended for you to continue his work after his death. But how can I prove that? Rebecca asked. William was so focused on his research that we never discussed detailed succession plans. He always said we'd have time for that later. The attorney's eyes softened with empathy. It's a common human failing to believe we have more time than we do. But there must be something. Correspondence, research notes, recorded conversations, anything that indicates William saw you as his research successor, not just his wife. The conversation shifted to a collective brainstorming session about where such evidence might exist. Dr. Abernathy suggested reviewing William's academic correspondence, while Dr. Santos recommended checking conference presentation materials where William might have acknowledged Rebecca's role in the research. As the discussion continued, Rebecca found her thoughts drifting to the private moments that wouldn't appear in any formal documentation, the late nights, when William had insisted she understand every aspect of his research protocols, just in case, the careful way he had taught her to recognize promising molecular structures, his habit of referring to the Foundation as our life's work rather than his alone. Those intimate moments of knowledge transfer weren't captured in legal documents or formal acknowledgments. They existed in the countless hours they had spent together in this very laboratory, his expertise flowing into her consciousness until the boundaries between his knowledge and hers became indistinguishable. The afternoon progressed with each team member pursuing different aspects of their 90-day strategy. Dr. Bennett and Sarah focused on preparing the expanded access application. Dr. Abernathy and Dr. Santos continued analyzing comparative outcome data, and Catherine began drafting legal arguments for the final hearing. Rebecca excused herself to check on a time-sensitive cell culture experiment, But as she walked through the quiet corridors of the house, she found herself drawn to William's private study. Unlike the main research areas that had become collaborative spaces, this room remained largely as he had left it, his personal sanctuary, where he had often retreated to think through complex research challenges. She hadn't spent much time here since his death, finding the concentrated essence of his absence too painful to bear. But now, seeking evidence of his intentions, she forced herself to enter the space that had been uniquely his. The study was lined with bookshelves containing medical texts, research journals, and the literature William had loved to read for pleasure: poetry, philosophy, and historical biographies of great healers throughout time. His antique desk stood by the window overlooking the winter garden, its surface clear except for a framed photograph of Rebecca taken on their 10th anniversary. Rebecca moved slowly through the room, running her fingers along book spines and opening drawers that had remained closed since William's death. In the bottom drawer of his desk, she found a leather-bound journal she didn't recognize. Opening it revealed William's distinctive handwriting, dated entries beginning approximately 6 months before his diagnosis. Her heart racing, Rebecca began to read, discovering that William had been keeping a research diary separate from his official laboratory notes. These were his private reflections on the Foundation's work, philosophical musings about the ethical implications of their discoveries, and personal notes about his hopes for the future of their shared mission. An entry from 3 months before his diagnosis caught her attention. Rebecca suggested a modification to the enzyme stabilization protocol today that might solve the degradation problem we've been struggling with for months. Her intuitive understanding of molecular structures continues to amaze me. While others see her as the doctor's wife, I've come to rely on her scientific insight as much as any colleague with formal medical credentials. If anything should happen to me, she is the only person I would trust to continue this work with the same commitment to putting patients before profits. Tears blurred Rebecca's vision as she continued reading, finding entry after entry that acknowledged her contributions and expressed William's confidence in her scientific capabilities. The journal wasn't a legal document, but it provided clear evidence of William's intentions and his recognition of Rebecca as a full partner in the Foundation's work. She was still reading when Dr. Bennett found her an hour later, concerned by her prolonged absence from the laboratory. Wordlessly, she handed him the journal, watching as he scanned several pages with growing interest. "This is significant," he said finally, looking up with new respect in his eyes. "Not just for the legal case, but for the scientific record. William clearly considered you a full research partner, not merely an administrative supporter." Rebecca nodded, a complicated mixture of emotions tightening her throat. Validation of her role felt bittersweet, coming too late for William to witness, but perhaps just in time to save their shared legacy. "We should show this to Catherine," Dr. Bennett suggested gently. These entries could be crucial for establishing William's intentions regarding the Foundation's future. As they returned to the main laboratory, Rebecca carried the journal carefully, aware that it represented not just legal evidence, but a final gift from William, his recognition of her capabilities preserved in his own handwriting. The remainder of the day passed in a flurry of activity as Catherine reviewed the journal entries and identified the most relevant passages for their legal strategy. The physician team continued their work on the expanded access application, energized by the knowledge that they now had stronger evidence of William's intentions. By evening, when the team finally dispersed to their respective homes, Rebecca found herself alone in the house that now felt more like a mission headquarters than a private residence. She wandered through the quiet rooms, reflecting on how much had changed in just 3 weeks. The foundation that Victor had dismissed as financially unsustainable was now operating with renewed purpose. Grant funding had been secured for the coming year. Research protocols were advancing with promising results, and patient families were actively advocating for the Foundation's continued independence. Yet Rebecca harbored no illusions about the challenges that remained. Victor's resources far exceeded hers, and Meridian Pharmaceuticals had a vested interest in acquiring the Foundation's research. The journal provided evidence of William's intentions, but courts often favored documented legal arrangements over personal writings, no matter how heartfelt. As she prepared for bed, Rebecca's phone chimed with a message from Dr. Bennett. Expanded access application submitted. First step toward proving the Foundation's work must continue uninterrupted. The simple notification carried profound implications. If approved, the expanded access program would allow dozens of additional children to receive the experimental treatment developed through the Foundation's research, children who might have no other medical options for their rare conditions. Rebecca replied with gratitude, then set her phone aside and moved to the window overlooking the winter landscape. The Harrington estate lay silent under a light dusting of snow, the research greenhouse gleaming like a crystal structure in the distance. Somewhere beyond the property boundaries, Victor was likely strategizing with Meridian executives, planning their next move in the corporate acquisition game. But here, in this moment, Rebecca felt a strange sense of peace despite the uncertainty ahead. William's journal had reminded her that their work had never been about property ownership or corporate valuations. It had been about bringing light to families navigating the darkness of devastating diagnoses, a mission that transcended legal battles and balance sheets. As she prepared to sleep, Rebecca thought about the children who might benefit from the expanded access program, imagining parents receiving calls offering treatment where none had existed before. That vision of hope replacing resignation, of possibility overcoming despair, was worth every struggle and sacrifice the coming weeks might require. The battle for William's legacy was far from over, but tonight, Rebecca would rest knowing that they had taken a significant step toward ensuring his compassionate approach to medicine would continue. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring another day to advance the healing work that had defined both their lives. In that knowledge, she found the strength to face whatever trials the remaining 66 days might hold. The expansion application approval came just 4 days later, arriving via official FDA correspondence early on a Thursday morning. Rebecca had been reviewing patient enrollment criteria with Sarah when Dr. Bennett called with the news, his normally measured voice vibrating with barely contained excitement. "They've not only approved expanded access," he explained, "they've granted it priority status based on the strength of our 6-month data. We can begin enrolling additional patients immediately." Sarah squeezed Rebecca's hand as she processed the implications. "This is unprecedented speed for an ultra-rare condition," she whispered. They must have been deeply impressed by the outcomes. Data. The approval represented more than administrative permission. It was professional validation of the Foundation's approach at the highest regulatory level. Beyond the immediate benefit to children waiting for treatment, it provided powerful evidence for their court case that the Foundation's work deserved to continue under its current leadership. "We need to inform the waiting families immediately," Rebecca said, already mentally composing the notifications that would transform parental despair into renewed hope, "and prepare the laboratory for increased production of the enzyme formulation." The day unfolded in a whirlwind of activity as the Foundation team implemented their expanded access protocols. By evening, 15 families had received notification that their children qualified for immediate treatment enrollment, with more evaluations scheduled for the coming week. As Rebecca finally headed home, exhausted but exhilarated by the day's developments, she found Dr. Bennett waiting beside her car in the parking lot. His expression suggested he carried news too important for a phone call. "Victor knows about the approval," he said without preamble. "His legal team has filed an emergency motion claiming that major program expansions during the 90-day period violate the spirit of the court's temporary arrangement." Rebecca leaned against her car, absorbing this latest complication. They're trying to block children from receiving treatment that could save their lives? How can they justify that? Their argument is that such significant commitments shouldn't be made until final ownership is determined. Dr. Bennett explained. They're claiming it's a deliberate attempt to create facts on the ground that would make it more difficult for the court to rule in Victor's favor. The accusation stung, partly because it contained a kernel of truth. While the expanded access application had been filed primarily to help waiting patients, Rebecca couldn't deny that its approval strengthened their legal position significantly. "What does Catherine say?" she asked. "She's already preparing our response. The FDA's independent approval provides strong justification that this expansion represents sound medical judgment, not legal maneuvering. But we should be prepared for increased scrutiny of every decision we make going forward." Rebecca nodded, understanding that Victor's challenge represented both a threat and an opportunity. His opposition to expanding treatment access revealed the fundamental difference between their approaches to medical research, her focus on patient needs versus his emphasis on corporate control. "Let him object," she said, a new resolve hardening her voice. "If Victor wants to explain to the court why he's trying to prevent dying children from receiving life-extending treatments, I welcome that conversation." Dr. Bennett studied her with quiet approval. "You're becoming quite the strategist, Rebecca. William would be proud to see how fiercely you're defending what you built together." The simple affirmation touched her deeply. In the weeks since the court hearing, Dr. Bennett had evolved from a professional ally into something more complex, a friend whose insight and integrity had become increasingly valuable as the battle intensified. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything you're doing to help save the foundation." "I'm not just helping the foundation," he replied, his gaze direct. "I'm helping preserve a vision of medicine that puts healing before profit. That's a cause worth fighting for, whatever the personal cost." As Rebecca drove home through the gathering darkness, she reflected on how the foundation's struggle had grown from a private battle over William's legacy into something much larger, a stand against the corporatization of healing itself. The expanded access approval represented both a victory for individual children and a statement about what medicine could be when patient needs drove research priorities rather than market analyses. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Victor escalated his opposition. But tonight, Rebecca would allow herself to celebrate this milestone, knowing that regardless of the court's final decision, children who might otherwise have had no hope would now receive treatment developed through William's compassionate vision and her determined preservation of his work. The light of that knowledge burned brighter than any uncertainty about the future, illuminating the path forward like the beam from a lighthouse cutting through darkness to guide travelers safely home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.